Hello everybody, this is ASMR, and today we're going to do something very interesting and a little different from what I normally do. I absolutely love color charts, as you know, and the other day I came across this really interesting chart that has many different colors. And what this chart represents is how people define themselves. So I am currently working on a PhD, and my PhD is in educational psychology. My areas of interest are basically learning through entertainment and learning through games, but there's a lot of psychology in education. And because of that, we were going through a course recently where one of the modules or one of the lessons discussed how people perceive themselves and why people perceive themselves in certain ways, and some of the social constructs and then some of the situational constructs, like for example the gender that you identify as, the race you are, your ethnicity, all of those things that you can't control, that you were sort of born into, kind of inherited, versus your experiences. And there's just an interesting little chart here just about some of the ways that people define themselves as being part of certain groups or social classes, and I thought it was very interesting. So I thought that today we could go over it, and I would have my pointer, of course. I'm just going to point to certain parts, and we can just discuss them and think about how this relates to you and how you perceive yourself. So firstly, we have this core here. So this is the center, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements in the center. So if this is a pizza, there'll be 6 slices here. Okay. So these elements here are typically considered things that we are either as a result, like for example our age. We have no control over our age. Our age is just what our age is, depending on when we were born. Physical abilities and qualities. Now these obviously may change over time because, for example, there are people that are born able to walk and able to see, and then unfortunately something may happen to them in life where they may lose their sight, they may lose their vision. So this is something that alters. Your ethnicity. Now this is something that you just are born into. There's nothing you can do about your ethnicity. There's nothing you can do about your race. So these are basically considered like core components of who you are. And now gender. So for many generations, there were really only 2 genders that were recognized, male and female. But now in today's world, obviously more and more people are exploring gender, and that gender can fall among a spectrum. So the kind of, the gender that you identify as, and the spectrum that you identify yourself on that gender, also plays a role in how people identify themselves. And the same thing with sexual orientation. It falls on a spectrum. The gender spectrum and the sexual orientation spectrum are actually very strongly linked together. So I find just that this is interesting. So for example, here in age, how does age define a person? Well, obviously, somebody who is 6 years old is going to be at a completely different cognitive development level than somebody who's, 30, somebody who's 60. I mean, actually, when people are young, like children, 6 years of age, if you look at a 6-year-old versus a 12-year-old, there's a huge difference. Look at a baby, for example. Look at all the things that a child who is maybe 5 years old can do that a little infant cannot. So when children are little, they just grow, like their minds are like sponges. But as you get older, you really are who you're going to become. Like by the time you're about 12 or 13, a lot of your core personality is set. It always alters, from your experiences, and your brain actually does not finish developing completely until you're 25. And It's interesting, though, that at age, that can make a difference with people's, cognitive abilities and functions. On the other hand, age can also make a difference on things like what you're interested in and what you want, what your hobbies are. So, for example, somebody in their 20s is probably a lot more interested in things like skateboarding and surfing than somebody who's, in their 60s or 70s. The kind of music that you like can also be strongly associated with age. However, music and the arts in general are interesting because you can have music from many years ago, from the 50s and the 60s, and when you expose modern day kids to it, they may very well end up liking the songs. So music and art definitely can be shared throughout different ages and the generations, but age does affect things like the social groups that people put themselves in a lot of times, and it does impact things like interest and things like conversation. So, for example, if you have a 20-year-old who's in a room with a bunch of 70-year-olds and everybody's having a conversation, chances are the 20-year-old may feel a little bit left out of the conversation because people in their 70s may be talking about things like like doctors and medicine. I know that sounds horrible, but there are many people, like I know from my experience with some of my older relatives, that when people meet up for barbecues and things, or we're having Easter or Christmas, around the dinner table, it's very, very common to talk about like aches and pains. And obviously, when people are younger, it's very hard to get involved with those conversations. On the other hand, for young people, if we sit there and start talking about things like, Game of Thrones, for example, a lot of older people don't know what you're talking about. That being said, my father's in his 70s and he loves Game of Thrones. So, again, media connects people, and, media and entertainment in general is like the great connector of age. But age is a great way for how we define ourselves and how we also define each other. Like we group people into different categories based on their ages. So that's one thing. Now, physical abilities and qualities. Now, this basically means two things, as you can imagine. So the first thing that this means is your physical abilities. So when you're born, they discuss, like when you're born, they see if child is developing correctly. Are they walking on time? Are they talking on time? And if they are, that means that they are basically physically fit. Obviously some people are born with physical disabilities. Some people are born with cognitive disabilities. So that's why you have physical abilities and qualities. So this really just pertains to how, let's say that you have a disability, like let's say you are deaf or you're blind. How does that impact how you see yourself? No pun intended. How does that impact like how you describe yourself and how you live your life? So for example, people who are blind may consider something like their involvement with Guiding Eyes for the Blind, which is an organization that gives guide dogs to people who are blind. A lot of people who are blind have cited that organization as doing some really wonderful things for them, and so they have a lot of friends from that group. They make friends in that group. They meet people in that group. They have charity events that they will involve people in for that group. So in that case, this is somebody who doesn't only define themselves as being, blind, as somebody who can't see, but somebody who is the owner of a guiding eye dog, of somebody who is a part of a group that benefits people who have visual impairments. And so it's interesting to look at it through physical abilities. How does that impact how you live your life and how you describe yourself and how you, the kind of people you interact with or certain groups that you interact with. The other way that this can be defined is that there are a lot of people who are very, they are physically completely fit, but certain people are just stronger than others. Certain people are more inclined to do things like sports than others. So in that case, physical abilities can also make a big difference when it comes to your hobbies. So for example, somebody who's very, very athletic may enjoy doing something like, partaking in American Ninja Warrior, where somebody who, like myself, is definitely not quite as fit. You know, I'm kind of scrawny, and I don't think that I would be very good on the apparatuses that American Ninja Warrior would not involve themselves with sports as much. So certain physical abilities can definitely also help somebody find their way in life. You know, if people have really excellent eyesight, they may decide to go into artistry and do some really intricate work. If somebody's really strong, they may decide to go into construction. So your physical abilities can definitely also influence how you see yourself and how you define yourself and how you decide to make your way in life, essentially. Now, your ethnicity. This is a really interesting topic, and this is something that really plays a huge role in a lot of people's lives. So when we talk about ethnicity, let's also talk about race. So when we talk about race and ethnicity, these two things are extremely closely linked. So, for example, I'll take myself as an example. Like, as you can see from my hands here, I'm white, so my race is Caucasian. A lot of people say I'm Caucasian, right? But Caucasians make up, you know, how much of the, pretty much everybody from Europe originally is Caucasian. So when you think about that, with ethnicity, what is the difference? So let's say that your race is white or your race is Caucasian, right? Your ethnicity describes what country you come from. So, for example, I myself am 100% Irish. So my ethnicity would be, I guess you could say Irish. The other terms that you can say are things like Celt or Gael, because those are like terms that are used to describe the Irish. Gael, Celt, that's like the old way to describe the ethnic group, essentially. So that's a very interesting thing to note. And your ethnicity can play a big role in how you view the world, and also things like, your childhood memories. For example, let's say if you take Europe, for example, people who are from Ireland and people who are from a country like Germany, for example, are white, but at the same point they have very different cultures. They may celebrate the same exact holidays, they may have similar weather patterns, but although I think Ireland is much rainier than Germany, to be honest, but they may have these very similar things, but they all have different stories. Like, for example, in Germany, the classic fairy tales were things like the Grimm fairy tales. In Ireland, you also have like very old legends. For example, in Ireland, one of the most famous old legends that almost everybody's heard of is the Banshee. So, you would have different legends. Now, of course, as communication opened up and everything, you would have more of a sharing of stories and cultures. Like, now everybody knows the Grimm fairy tales. But ethnicity does play a big role in the kind of food you eat. Like, there's different foods from every single different culture. There are foods, like food from Italy is very different from food in Germany, and food in Germany differs from food in Sweden, and food in Sweden differs from food in Ireland. So, it also impacts your, maybe foods that you grew up eating. Although, again, in today's world, everything is like there's so much globalization now that you can pretty much get any kind of food that you want, which is really cool. Another thing to note in race and ethnicity, another component of ethnicity, you can also say, what country if you come from. So, for example, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm American. I was born in America. I'm actually from New York. I was born in New York, but my family's from Ireland. So basically the way that I would describe myself is that I am American. My nationality is American, but my ethnicity is Irish, and then my race is white. So it's interesting how those things tie in together. And a lot of people define themselves more by their ethnicity than by their race. Like, because obviously when you walk into a room, people can tell if you're white, they can tell if you're black, they can tell if you're Asian, but ethnicity is something that people definitely put a little bit more emphasis on. So for example, if somebody asks you, like, oh, where do you come from, where's your family from, you're less likely to say, oh, we're white, than you are to say, we're from Ireland, we're from Italy, we're from Germany, we're from France. You're more likely to say what country you're from. And that also plays into the ethnicity, because all the different cultures have different ways of doing things and different, my mind is going blank, I'm trying to think of the word, different traditions. Different traditions. So it's very interesting. I might actually do a book around Christmas. I have a great book that talks about all the different ways that Christmas is celebrated in various countries, like how it's celebrated in like all the different European countries and Russia and Australia and, you know, America and South America and Africa. So I definitely should do something like that around Christmas, and that will show how like one holiday is celebrated so differently from different countries and different groups. So then we have gender here. Now, gender traditionally was just you were male or female, you were born male, you were born female. Today's world, this is being expanded pretty rapidly. But how you define yourself, whether you define yourself as male or female, really does make a big difference on how you perceive yourself. As you guys can probably tell from my nails and hopefully from my voice, because I think I have a really deep voice. I've never actually liked my voice. That's why I'm always amazed when you guys get online and say to me, oh, you have such a nice voice. That always amazes me, because I don't like it. I think it's really deep for a girl. But I am female, and I actually describe myself as a cis, I think they call it cis, C-I-S, female, which basically means that I was born female and I identify as female. I am in fact quite a girly girl. I like makeup, I like nails, I have long hair, I like high heels. So yeah, I'm definitely girly, and I like glitter. So I'm like the stereotypical girly girl. Talk about race now. Sexual orientation. So this is another area that the spectrum is just absolutely expanding rapidly. So years ago, it was really just you were heterosexual or you were homosexual. And today's world, this is expanding like really, really rapidly. Now you have, you know, acknowledgement of things like asexuality. And it's just interesting how much that this has really, really grown in the last couple of years. So for myself, like I consider myself female, and I consider myself, for the most part, heterosexual, but considering some of the men around where I live, I think that there are times that I just feel quite asexual, and I think you would too if you lived in my neighborhood. So anyway, moving on. So these are like the core components of a person. Now, if you look at some of these, you have all these beautiful colors. So firstly, let's count them. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 15, right? Because we started here, or 16. I've lost count. I make these videos late at night when I'm tired, which is not good. But it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, let's start counting from the green ones. That's just easier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It was 16. Okay. So here we have light green, dark green, kind of a medium blue, purple, kind of a more, I guess you would say, what would that be? More of like a grape purple, purple, red, orange, yellow, light green, dark green, more of the medium blue, purple, again that kind of grape purple, and then we have magenta pink, Barbie pink, and light pink. And each one of these 16 tabs also has some words in it that describe something that may explain how people help define themselves. So firstly, we have this one here called thinking styles. Now, this is interesting. As I said, this chart came from some schoolwork that I had, and it is educational psychology. So when we talk about thinking styles, the other term for this is learning styles. So basically, people learn in different ways. Some people are better off learning by doing something. Some people are better off learning by listening to somebody, you know, give a speech rather than read a speech in a textbook. Whereas other people are actually learn best from reading textbooks. So when we talk about thinking styles, this really describes, we define ourselves by how we think, how we learn. This is something that is really popular now because the customization of education is getting so popular. So in today's world, when we have, a lot of, especially with online learning, which I am a huge proponent of, with online learning, we are able to tailor curriculums. We're able to tailor lessons, and it's just becoming easier and easier to reach people who learn and benefit from learning in different ways. Somebody who maybe doesn't learn well traditionally from just sitting there, reading something in a textbook, may learn much better from watching a video. They may learn much better, like, for example, there's a lot of people that can learn from watching documentaries more than being forced to sit there and read a documentary style book. So that's one example of, like, leaky styles. Another thing that this covers are issues such as learning, what do they call them? Learning disorders, like, for example, ADHD and dyslexia. These are things that years ago used to really impede people's ability to do well in school. Now that we understand these conditions more, we can actually tailor curriculums that help people that have these conditions to learn in a way that best suits them. So this is very interesting. So even though we don't normally, the average person does not normally define themselves by their thinking style or their learning preference, this is included on this chart because of where the chart comes from, and it is interesting. I believe you can take a couple of free quizzes online if you're curious to see about your thinking style. So that's an issue one. Now, then you have geographic location. So geographic location describes how does your location influence who you are. So, for example, if you grow up in a very small rural community, you are probably much more familiar with farm animals. You probably have had more experience with farming than somebody who grew up in a big, thriving urban metropolitan. So geographic location can influence things like, what you are accustomed to seeing in your daily life. It can also influence how you live your life. Like, are you living in a peaceful society, or are you living in the middle of a war zone? That can really obviously impact how you live your life daily and how you describe your life and how you describe yourself and your experiences. Parental status, this goes without saying. So parental status means, are you a parent or are you not? Now, I am not a parent, but I have heard that when you become a parent, it completely changes your way of thinking. It completely changes your way of perceiving life, because everything becomes about protecting your children. So your parental status also makes a huge impact on how you view yourself and how you present yourself to others. Most people who are parents are very proud to be parents and will proudly say that they're a mom or they're a dad. And then obviously that also casts them into, a different role in life, because when you are a parent, that should really be your primary concern. First and foremost is your children, and everything else comes secondary. So this is a key one to how people define themselves, whether or not they have children. Education. This is another one that education really can have a huge impact on people's quality of life. There's been numerous studies that prove that the more education you have, typically the better off you are. Now, of course, higher education is not for everybody, so you don't need to have a PhD to, do well, nothing like that. But even for things like, let's say that you want to be an electrician, let's say you want to be a plumber, to do those things legally, you have to get licensed, and you have to go through licensing processes, and they have schools for it. So your education level does impact how much you're going to succeed, whether or not you're going into vocational school or academia. So, for example, in my case with education, I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and right now I'm going for my PhD, but I don't have a PhD yet. But when I succeed, provided everything goes well, I don't want to jinx myself, provided everything goes well, once I have completed my education, I can put PhD behind my name, and I can technically call myself doctor, although I think that that's kind of silly, because to me, being a doctor is being a medical doctor, and that's not what I do. So I guess I'll be more likely just to put PhD behind my name on things, and then I will also be more likely to kind of consider myself a scholar, because that's really what I want to be, a scholar. I've always often wondered why PhDs are called doctors. I feel like we should be given the title of like scholar rather than doctor, because it is very confusing to call people with PhDs doctors, because when you think doctor, you think medical. So interesting. Now this one really interested me: smoker versus non-smoker. Now normally you would never think that something like this would be how you would define yourself, but at the same point it really is in today's world, because now that smoking has become so controversial, because we understand the health risk. People who are smokers consider themselves part of one tribe, and people who are non-smokers consider themselves part of the other tribe. I am a non-smoker, but I know smokers, and what's interesting about me is like I do not smoke. I don't intend to smoke, but smoking around me, I know they always want about like secondhand smoke, but as long as somebody smokes with a window open around me, I don't get really, upset about it. I just don't, as long as the smoke's not flying in my face. But this has become a really interesting point, because there's a lot of non-smokers now that basically don't want to be in the same room as smokers. They don't want to inhale it at all, and that probably makes sense, because there are some bad secondhand smoke things that can happen to you. Now this one up here is work background. So your work background is really one of the single most defining things that you can tell people about yourself. Your work background can tell you about your what you do, what your whole, some people make work their entire lives. There are people that have forged such famous careers that they are recognized primarily for what they do. Obviously, singers, actors, and actresses. People like Elvis Presley, for example. He was so famous that people knew him from his first name. You said Elvis, and you knew he was a singer, because his career and his work background was like the defining aspect of his persona that the public saw. So this one is really, really interesting, because a lot of people will define themselves first and foremost as saying what they do for a living. I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher. So this one is very, very important. Then up here we have communication style. So this one is kind of more of like a teacherly sort of way of thinking about yourself, just like the thinking styles. Well, communication style describes how you communicate. There are a lot of studies done that prove that different people communicate in different ways. Some of this has to do with personality type, some of it has to do with environmental factors, but the way that you prefer to communicate, or the style of communication that you have, is very much a core part of your personality. The most obvious part of communication style involves your personality style, and there are two main personality styles. So there's extroverts and there's introverts, and extroverts are going to communicate way more readily than introverts, who kind of keep things inside. And despite how much talking I'm doing on this video, I am an introvert. But yeah, communication styles are interesting. If you Google this term, you'll find a wealth of information, with extroverted and introverted personalities being probably the most defining factor of communication style. But then from there, we'll break down and talk about different styles of communication, different ways that people prefer to communicate. Some people are better at reading non-verbal cues, for example, than others are. And you can probably find some free tests online, like those little quizzes that will tell you what your communication style is. It's very interesting. Now this one here, this yellow one, this is economic status. This is a big one. Pretty much everybody knows what economic status they fall into. If you grew up poor, you're going to know you were poor. If you grew up filthy rich, you're going to know you were filthy rich. This one is probably the biggest way, one of the biggest ways that people define themselves. And economic status also has a massive, massive effect on opportunities that you have in your life, the kind of experiences you have in your life. For example, if you're born very economically disadvantaged, you're less likely to go on to higher education, or if you do, you're going to have more struggle paying for it, for the most part, unless of course you are able to get a grant or scholarship. But if you're very, very wealthy, you're obviously going to be able to travel more. You're going to be able to go out and party more and have a much easier life than somebody who is not economically wealthy. wealthy or economically privileged. The other thing about this economic status is that people of the same economic statuses do hang around with each other very readily. So somebody who was very, very wealthy, and especially those who were raised with money and raised wealthy, are way more likely to hang around at places like golf clubs and golf clubs and yacht clubs than somebody who was raised in a poorer environment. Now, obviously, people can raise up through the ranks. There's many people that started out very poor and turned out to be very rich. But economic status does also very much color your experiences. So, for example, if somebody was born very poor and then became very rich, even when they were very rich, they remember what it was like to be poor. And that will make them have different views on life and different outlooks, for the most part, than somebody who was born rich and has never known anything different, or somebody who was born poor and never have known anything different. So this is a big one. Now, family and work life, so this obviously makes a difference. So this is a major one as well. So this involves your family. What kind of family do you come from? What kind of family do you have? Do you have a nuclear family? Are you a parent? Do you have children? Or, if you don't have children yourself, like, what kind of family do you come from? What was your birth order? Did you have siblings? If you did have siblings, were you the oldest? Were you the youngest? Were you the middle child? All of those things make a really big impact on your life and even the way that you perceive yourself and the way that you think. It's interesting if you look up things like birth order, which typically consists of oldest child, middle child, youngest child, and only child, although you can also find more specific ones that also talk about, like, let's say you come from a huge family and you have like 5 or 6 kids in your family and you're like the second oldest or the second youngest. You can find some very specific charts that will talk about like the typical personality traits. Everybody's different, but the typical personality traits from that birth order. And that's very interesting. Birth order does make a big difference. Like, I'm an only child, and a lot of the things that they say about only children do apply to me on this. And then, of course, you have marital status. So this is another one that is a very, very big component of how we view ourselves, whether you're married, whether you're single. So right now, I am not married. But if somebody is married, what's interesting in our society, in most societies, is that you can pretty much tell right away because people who are married wear wedding rings. So marital status is one of the biggest status symbols, I would say, along with like economic status, parental status. I would say marital status is probably one, and things like, of course, like, gender, racial, physical abilities. Marital status is one of the primary ways that we define who we are, where if we're somebody's wife, that, or somebody's girlfriend or somebody's fiance, that is how we kind of perceive ourselves and how we, even when we talk to other people, if you talk about like my boyfriend, my husband, my whatever, you're putting you're basically allowing other people to see you through the scope of being being in a partnership. So marital status makes a big difference for how we how we perceive ourselves, and how we allow others to perceive us, essentially, like how we introduce ourselves to other people. Like in some settings, you may introduce yourself and say, oh, I'm so-and-so's wife, I'm so-and-so's girlfriend, and that's how that makes a difference. Another thing about marital status that's interesting is that there's so many different ways to define it. So people who have been married and are now divorced typically don't call themselves single. They typically say, I'm a divorcee. So it just shows like how defining marriage is, that even if a marriage ends, you're unlikely to call yourself single. You're more likely to call yourself a divorcee, because single typically tends to mean that you've never been married. Not in all cases. I mean, you can definitely be divorced and say you're single, and be truthful, but just as a society, we still sort of tend to see, single as being never married or married, and then if you've been married and it's, you got divorced, you're a divorcee. Or if you are married and your spouse dies, you'll say that you're a widow or a widower. That's very interesting. But I've never been married, so I would fall into the single status. And then we have functional speciality. Now, this is something that, again, is probably a term that is not used very often, but this basically means functional speciality is essentially, it's kind of the same thing as work background. It basically means what you like to do. It does play in primarily in like what do you function highest at. So for example, I am dreadful at math. I mean, I can barely add it. It's pathetic. But I am very, very, very high functioning in English and in writing. I'm very, very proficient. So because of that, my functional specialty has always been like literature or literature-related topics. Now, functional speciality can also, in other cases, tie into things like hobbies. Like, what do you like to do? So some people who are like really skilled fishermen, somebody who's a really skilled, chess player, even if they are a musician, even non-professional musician, if you are really good at something like functional speciality, you may start to consider yourself through that scope. So let's say that somebody's a really, really good fisherman and they love to fish. They may describe themselves as a fisherman before anything else. Like let's say that they work in a supermarket, but they love to go fishing on the weekends. They may introduce themselves to people or consider themselves a fisherman much more than they would, say, oh, I define myself because I'm a store clerk. They would define themselves more as being a fisherman. And I use that example from somebody that I know who's absolutely addicted to fishing. And he throws the fish back. He just catches them and throws them back in the water, which is nice. Military experience. Now, this is another one that we don't normally think about that somebody might define themselves as, but it makes a difference. If you've been in the military or not in the military, it does totally color your way of looking at the world. People who have come out of the military, especially if they've had bad experiences, can be scarred for life from that. With PTSD, some of them end up losing limbs, which comes back to the physical abilities. They actually may lose some of the physical abilities they were born with. On a more positive note, some people go into the military, say it gave them discipline, it gave them more opportunities than they would ever have, especially when they came out of the service. So military experience definitely does color how people see the world. Then you also get people like myself who, would be dreadful at anything to do with the military, that like wouldn't want anything part of it. So it's interesting that, it's two very different groups of people, those that actively want to join the military and those that know they wouldn't be good at it. And that also, there's been some studies done that basically show that certain personality types are definitely more suited for military life than others. Then here we have job level. So job level describes what you are in your job. Are you a brand new employee? Are you new to the job? Are you a manager? Are you the head of the company? Job level can make a big, big difference in how other people perceive you and how you perceive yourself. So if let's say that you're like the head of a company, then obviously you have a lot of responsibilities. You will probably introduce yourself as a founder and a CEO. You'll probably have a lot of pride in that, but you also have a lot of responsibilities. If you're somebody who's a manager, you're definitely not as high up as a CEO or anything, but you still have a certain level of power of others. And if you're somebody who's an entry-level worker, more, standard employee, entry-level worker, you are more likely to either, aspire to become a manager, or some people are just very, happy just working at, more of like the entry level. So this is just interesting to note, because as you rise up in your job, like for example, as people get promotions, they, may change job titles, and that's how they may start to introduce themselves, especially within the working world. Once they get promotions, they can start, your title may change. Like you go from being an employee to being a manager, and then, and even in managerial positions, there's different tiers of manager. So that's an interesting one. Now this one here, native born versus non-native born, this makes a big difference in how you perceive yourself and also how you are perceived in many cases. So native born basically means that you were born into the country that you live in currently. Non-native born means that you are an immigrant. Now I was born here, but my parents are immigrants, and it's interesting to note that when you are bored in a country, you know, you're kind of just bored up around certain things, and you just take things for granted because you're so used to them being there because you always lived in the country. But when somebody is non-native and they come to live in a new country, there are certain things they have to get used to. For example, when my father first came here, he had to learn how to drive an automatic car because he only knew how to drive a standard shift, because that's what they drive in Ireland. To this day, standard shifts are more common in Ireland than automatic cars. You can get automatic cars, but they're more expensive. In America, automatic cars are by far the more common. Also in Ireland, people drive on what Americans call the wrong side of the road. So when my father first started driving in America, he had to get really used to driving on, you know, the different side of the road. And that can definitely be kind of confusing, as you can imagine. So there's just little things like that that can make a big difference, you know. And also, when you're non-native born, you tend to have a much more of a connection with the country that your family comes from. So, for example, like people who are non-native born are more likely to travel back to their old country, you know, to visit, as long as they left under, you know, good circumstances, as long as they're not, you know, war refugees or something like that. Like for the most part, there's just more of a connection with the old country. And like even myself, as I said, I was born here, but you know, I definitely do have strong. I'm a dual citizen, and I definitely do have very strong connections to Ireland, like stronger than people who are only connected by like grandparents or great grandparents. So that's interesting. And then here we have religious beliefs, and this also is a very core factor. Religious beliefs, parental status, marital status, or family and economic status are really the core things that describe us in a lot of ways. So religious beliefs will tie into, you know, typically it will tie into essentially two different things. It will tie into what you were taught growing up about right and wrong, although most of the world's religions, if you look at it, have very similar kind of golden rules. Like if you look at the Ten Commandments, for example, pretty much every religion says similar things, which is very interesting. There's some, you know, core rules that go across all spectrums. But religious beliefs will also really strongly figure in how you celebrate holidays and the kind of memories you have of holidays and what you consider to be holidays. Like for example, myself. I mean, as I said, I'm pure Irish, so therefore I am Roman Catholic. That comes with the territory with us. So with religious beliefs, for example, one of the strongest ways that religion has influenced me. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember having a communion. I remember having confirmation. When I was little, I was baptized. Also, the strongest thing, I am not super religious by any stretch of the imagination, but the most core way that religious beliefs have tailored me or have shaped me in my life is a deep love of Christmas and Easter. Those two holidays are still among my favorite holidays, although Christmas is by far my favorite. Easter and Halloween are kind of tied, but Christmas is like by far my favorite holiday. Nothing comes even close to it. But when I was growing up, celebrating those holidays were like highlights of my childhood, basically. I mean, I had, for the most part, a very, very happy childhood. But, you know, waking up on Christmas morning and seeing the presents that Santa left, or, you know, going out into the living room on Easter morning and having a huge Easter basket there from the Easter Bunny and all the chocolate and toys, and then having to find all the eggs that were hidden around the house. I mean, those are among the most wonderful memories I've ever had. And there's something that, you know, will always define me. Another thing about religious beliefs is that a lot of culture can be, and a lot of media can also be based around religious beliefs. Like if you look at Christmas, look at how many songs Christmas has inspired. Look at how many storybooks Christmas has inspired. You know, all of those things also tie into how you define yourself and the kind of media you saw as a kid and things that you remember. So it's just very interesting, you know, how much religion can play a role, even if you're not somebody that goes to church regularly, even if you're somebody who doesn't consider themselves very religious. Chances are, whatever religion you were born into definitely has impacted you in some way. Like in my case, it's just an undying love for Christmas and Easter. And then here, now this one is probably the most bizarre one. Some people that are watching this will probably think this is funny, but union or non-union. So this is really a term, this chart obviously was geared towards Americans because I go to school in America, but this is an issue in other countries as well. Union and non-union, this is tied directly into the whole job level and work background. So what this means is that union jobs are, unions do a lot of things to protect workers. So they're jobs that are considered union jobs typically are much better to work for than companies that are non-union. So if you can get a union job, you're taken care of much better than non-union jobs. Unions are also something that are really set up for workers, for people more at the entry level. Like once you get up to managerial positions, you can no longer be in the union. I won't say exactly what company he worked for, but when my father first came here, he got a job, and it was a union job, and he worked his way up. He basically started, when he came here from Ireland, he did not have a college education. His family did not have any money. They were poor farmers, and he didn't have a college education, but he got an entry-level job at a company that was in the union. So once he got into the company, he was in the union, and while he was working at the company, they were good enough to pay for his bachelor's degree. And then once he got a bachelor's, a couple of years later, he went back and got his master's degree. And he eventually took on managerial roles. He actually ended up retiring from the company after over 40 years. And he was quite high up by that point. But he had attained all of that because the unions had been very good to him when he was working and provided a lot of opportunities. So even when he became a manager and was out of the union, he was always very vocally supportive of the unions, and is a big believer of unions to this day. And I am as well. I feel that unions do a lot to protect workers. But union versus non-union also describes how you may define yourself. So from a political point of view, it means like whether you're for unions or against them. But from a point of view, if you're looking at it from the worker's point of view, union workers tend to be a lot better taken care of and tend to be happier workers and better at their job. I shouldn't say better at their job, but more dedicated to their job. Because they're treated well, than somebody who's, a non-union worker who's maybe not as treated as well, doesn't have as much job security, is typically more stressed about their job. Because another interesting bunch of studies you'll find is that workers who are happy and workers who feel fulfilled and workers who work for companies where they feel that they're respected and that they have job security are much more productive workers. So if you treat people well, you kind of get it back. It's almost like a karma type of thing. So I just thought that this was an interesting color wheel. I'm sorry that I talked about it for nearly an hour, but if I bored you to sleep, that is a good thing because it is an ASMR video. So thank you for watching this video, and I will see you again soon with some more relaxing videos and charts, and I will do more traditional color charts in the future as well.